And so, you know, people have asked me, for example, I'm very opposed to the idea that the fundamental human motivation is power, which is pretty much what every student is taught at every level of their education, in every educational institution, except a handful now across your country. Fundamental motivation is power. There's no place for people of goodwill to meet and engage in constructive dialogue, dialogos, none of that, because our fundamental motivation is nothing but the will to power. And so there is no place for people of goodwill to meet. There is no such thing as dialogue. It's all a mask, a rationalization, a post hoc rationalization for pretension and power. It's such a dismal philosophy. It's so, you could not, and I believe this technically, you could not formulate a more pathological philosophy. It obliterates your faith in society, and it eradicates the notion of the individual. It removes the notion of good faith and goodwill, and it makes communication impossible. It's like, that's a temptation to engage in that sort of destruction as a consequence of your intellectual pretensions, let's say. And for all of you, this is going to face you too, this pretension, you know? So maybe you're not the hopeless type, and the temptation that assails you at the crossroads isn't your degeneration into a kind of faithless nihilism. Maybe it's a self-aggrandizement in some sense instead, and that you feel that now you have the opportunity to serve your own ambition. Well, we could take apart what that means, because I think it's worthwhile. Psychopaths serve their own ambition. And they're the people who are most truly motivated by power, by the way, if you think about it clinically. And they're not very successful, all protestations to the contrary. They never rise above about 3% of any general population. And maybe it's a better strategy to be a manipulative psychopath than to lay inert on in your bed, in your mother's bedroom when you're 40, but it's not an optimal strategy. And so you can get away with it being a psychopath because you can mimic competence and you can take advantage of people who have learned to expect the best from others, and so you can manipulate them. But you produce nothing on your own. And one of the things that's really interesting about psychopaths is they don't learn from experience, which means not only do they betray other people constantly, but they betray their own future selves. And there's really no difference between your future self and someone else, right? You know, if you're going to act ethically, and this is a very good way of thinking about acting ethically, you act in a way that works for you now, that works for you tomorrow, that works for you next week and next month and next year and in 5 years and in 10 years, and for you and your family and your friends and your broader community, and all of that simultaneously. And that's a place to find purpose in your life, to manage that balancing act simultaneously, and to sacrifice your narrow, self-oriented pretensions, ambition, all of that, the celebration of your own intellect, the construction of your own empire for your own narrow purposes. Part of the reason you shouldn't do that, even though it's tempting in some sense, especially if you have the ability, is because, do you want to rule over hell? I mean, and that's another interesting question with regards to the question of whether power is a valid motivation. It's like, okay, well, Kim Jong-un, let's take Kim. He's a manifestation of a power player. You think it's better to be leader of North Korea than to be just an ordinary peon there? Are you so sure it's better to rule over hell than just to be a servant in hell? It's not obvious to me. That's not success by any stretch of the imagination. The most powerful devil. That's like the worst possible failure. And so, you know, you're called upon to take the lessons that you've been taught in a university like this, that attempts to teach you to abide by the eternal verities, to sacrifice your own narrow pretensions in the highest sense to something that's truly better, not because you should in some finger-wagging sense, but because there is truly nothing better, and perhaps you don't have the wisdom to see that, because it's difficult to see. It's difficult to have a purview broad enough to encompass those expanse of time and community and see what pattern of behavior is to be manifested in proper service to balance all of that in some musical manner. But that's definitely the appropriate pathway. It's the best possible path of action. And anything you pursue that isn't that is insufficient, especially for people of your ability. And I would also say, and this is very much worth thinking about too, you know, there is this idea that your great country is founded upon, for example, that each individual is of divine worth. You know, and I made reference to this client I had when I was a junior therapist, and so even the most, what would you say, ignored and alienated, marginalized, let's say, to use a word that's been overused, have something of real value to bring into the world. this is the case. You're a particularized creature as a son of God or a daughter of God, let's say. You have something to bring into the world that no one else can bring in. And so if you fail in that duty, then you deprive the world of that. And maybe you shouldn't do that. Like maybe everything's lesser if you do that. And you don't know how much lesser, because the world is also constituted in a very strange way. Dostoevsky said that we're not only responsible for what we do, but for what everyone else does, which is truly an insane thing to say, but also in some sense fundamentally true. I don't know how it is that each of us can bear the burden of the world on our shoulders singularly, because I can't really comprehend how things can be structured in that manner, but I do believe nonetheless that it is the case, and so that if you forswear your responsibility to the highest good, then you tear something out of the fabric of being that is of inestimable value. And I do believe you will pay for that if you do it, and I would suggest that you don't pay that price, because it will not be pleasant. That's definitely hell. And if you don't think hell is real, you haven't thought about it enough. It isn't a matter of other people believing foolish things. It's a matter of you being so naive and so well protected that you have no idea how the world is constituted. And so that's the temptations, let's say. Chaos and nihilism and hopelessness, or intellectual pretension and the desire for self-aggrandizement and narrow power. Don't do that. It's not helpful. It won't do you any good. And it's beneath you. It's beneath you to do that. And that will manifest itself in your life, that subordination of what's highest in you to those lesser gods, let's say. That'll manifest itself in the torments of your own conscience. And no one escapes from that, And so, don't do that. Don't make that choice at the crossroads.